Hello and Fairfaye. My name is David Hume. I'm a author, writer, historian and broadcaster, and I'm an Ulster Scot. So I'm here today to talk to you about Ulster Scots language. I was born in a wee village called Ballycarry in County Antrim. It's set on a hillside on the Antrim coast overlooking Island Magee and the North Channel. And on a clear day we can see the Scottish coast just 22 miles away from us. We're as close to Scotland as we are to Belfast. This proximity to Scotland was something taken for granted as I was growing up, and so too were the words and the dialect I heard from the older people in the countryside and the community around me. People like Davy Craig, a neighbour and an old farmer who lived near the Lady Brae in the outskirts of the village. Davy talked about ganging up the brae to get to the tune. He talked about the polis, the wains running about, it being a queer day, and much more. Sang I would have been his affirmation that something was correct. Twarthy was two or three. Didn't he say that if he was hearing less than good news? Now, when I was growing up, I didn't really think too much about this because it was just commonplace. And it was only in later years then that I began to understand and appreciate that I'd been quite privileged really to be hearing the remnants of an old tongue that had been spoken in that community for generations and for hundreds of years. And it set me on a journey about Ulster Scots and the language and the words that were still around. James Orr was born in 1770 and he was a weaver following in family tradition. He was, like many of his neighbours, a radical Presbyterian, and this led him to involvement in the United Irish Society and to rebellion. The United Irish Rebellion, or 1798 Rising, was known by a different term in the Ulster Scots community in County Antrim. They called it the Turn Out. Orr ended up having to flee to America for a time after the ill-fated Rising, but he provided unique accounts and reflections on the period through his poems. One of them is The Wanderer, which tells of the plight of one of the insurgents trying to avoid capture after the Battle of Antrim. Now, this is a little book of Orr's poetry that was reprinted in 1935 by a committee of local people who were keen to preserve his memory. And it's a fantastic little book, some amazing poems, including The Wanderer, which is really, really good, I think, from the point of view of an understanding of the Ulster Scots dialect and the words that are used and how people would have spoken back then. It's a very short poem. It was intended originally to be a song. It was set to music to an Irish tune called Mary's Dream. And it's quite a simple story, a very human story, and some really interesting Ulster Scots words. So let's see if you can follow this the way Orr wrote it in Ulster Scots and if you can understand what it's all about. "Was there?" she asked. The wanderer's rap against the pane, the lassie's skirt, the blast that braid on slimmest top, would hardly let a hate be heard. "A freen," he cried, "for common crimes, toast through the country fore and aft. Merlone," quo' she, "there's woeful times, the herd's aboon me on the laft." "I caught," he whispered, "wi' a wight, whom oft I've helped wi' hand and purse. He wouldna let me stay a night. Weel, sic a heart's a greater curse. But Leesie's gentler. Hark that hail! This piercing night is rucker far. Come round," she said, "and shun the gale. I'm going to slip aside the bar. Wae's me, how wet you're. Gi'e your hat, and dry your face wi' something hey. And sic a tacking weel I wat, I would preserve my greatest fee. We'll mak nae fire, the picket bauld might see the light and maybe stop. But I'll sit up, my bed's no cold. Gae till it a wee, and tak a nap." So I hope you got a flavour of what that was all about. This man is trying to avoid the authorities. This is after the Battle of Antrim. He's on Slemish Mountain or Slimmest Tap, and he seeks shelter. It's a rough night. There's a gale, It's cold and wet, and he goes to this house and knocks at the window, scaring the girl inside, and then the conversation takes place that he's tried to get shelter somewhere else. Somebody he's helped in the past. He says there, "I wait. Well, I'm oft have helped with hand and purse. A man I've often helped with hand and purse in the past, and he wouldn't let me stay a night. Well, such a heart's a greater curse." But he trusts that Lizzie, this is her, she's going to look after him and let him into the house for that night to get away from the gale. And she does. That's what she does. But she does tell him that the herds have been her on the loft. So there's a shepherd, or it could be her father or her brother or her husband above her on the loft, and he's got to be quiet because maybe he's not able to trust the other man and the loft above as well. So it's just a fantastic little poem. It's 3 verses, quite short, but there's so many Ulster Scots words there and phrases and language that you get a flavour of from Orr. Orr was writing that about the period after 1798, so that gives us a sense of where the language was at just at that particular time. So a lovely little poem. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you got a flavour of it and a sense of what it was all about. The Oars were one of the old Scots families who came into our area in the early 1600s, so James Orr was one of their descendants. Many other families settled in Antrim and Down from 1606 onwards, and they were followed then by the official Ulster plantation, which brought many more into the other counties of Ulster. These people brought with them their customs, their culture, and their way of life. A lot of them, most of them probably, were tenant farmers back then, and they introduced new farming techniques to the new areas that they came to. Some of their architecture can also be seen today if you travel to Hannah's Close at Kilkeel in County Down, or to Ballygally on the Antrim Coast Road. But most importantly, from our point of view today, these people brought with them their language. Ulster Scots is also called Ullans. It's a variant of Scots, the language that was used by Robert Burns in many of his poems. And Scots is still spoken in the lowlands of Scotland today. It's often called Lallans, the Scots word for lowlands. And Scots is part of the West Germanic family of languages. Other languages in that West Germanic family include English, Dutch, Flemish, German and Frisian, for example. And Scots and Ulster Scots are descended from the Northumbrian dialect of Anglo-Saxon, which was brought to the British Isles approximately 1,500 years ago. And modern English is derived from the Mercian dialect of Anglo-Saxon. So Ulster Scots and English are cousins, but they are not the same language, and Ulster Scots is not, just as some people like to think, bad use of English. And we'll come to that in our exploration here, because that sense of Ulster Scots being a rude and uneducated language played a very important part in its decline over the years. One of what is considered James Orr's best poems, in fact, the poet John Hewitt considered it better poetry than anything written by Robert Burns, is the Irish Cottier's Death and Burial. And in that poem, Orr gives us a sense of why the language went into decline. And the Irish Cottier's Death and Burial is about the passing of the Cottier and the neighbours coming in, the traditional wake we would associate with all of that. So Orr gives us a picture of this, and I want you to listen to just a couple of verses here, and then particularly the second verse, which talks about what happens when the minister arrives at the house. So this is a little extract from the Irish Cottier's Death and Burial. Ranged round the hearth, where he presides nae mair, the inquiring nibbers mourn their suffering freen, and now and then divert awa their care by telling tales to please some glaikit wean. Wha's eye soon fills when told about the pain its sair endures, and what his loss would be, and much they say, but lass in vain, to soothe the mother, wha half pleased could see her partner eased by death, though for his life should die. And while they're proving that his end is sure by strange ill omens to assuage his smart, the minister comes in, wha to the poor, without a fee, performs the doctor's part. And while we hope he soothes the sufferer's heart, and gies a cheap, safe recipe they try, to quat braid Scotch, a task that foils their art, for while they join his converse, vain though shy, they mony a lang learned word misca and misapply. And that's a really interesting passage from Oars' poem, because he sets the scene that all the neighbours are there. It's a sad occasion, it's a sad house, and the minister calls, the minister comes to speak to the family. And once the minister comes in, things change. Things change significantly from the point of view of the language that is being used in the house. It says here that they try to quat braid Scotch, a task that foils their art. So you see, the minister is an educated man. He has education. And when he comes to the house, they don't want to speak in broad Scotch, because that seems to say that they are not educated, they're rude, they're ignorant, and they want to try and be on a par with the minister because he speaks English, and that's seen as the badge of education and knowledge. But of course, in trying to speak English, we learn from Orr that it all goes a bit wrong, because he says that while they join his converse, vain though shy, they mony a lang learned word misca and misapply. So they're using words in the wrong context, they're pronouncing them wrong, all of that's happening. And that gives us a really interesting insight into where the language was at. Now, Orr wrote that poem. It was published posthumously, and Orr died in 1816. So he was familiar with this process in his lifetime. He was born in 1770, and he died then in 1816. The interesting thing is that Orr, of course, is doing the same thing in his poems. So in that particular poem, you'll notice the Ulster Scots words being used and phrases being used, but also you'll see the standard English being used as well. And that is a process that was already happening then and continued right on down the line. My own grandfather was a songwriter and an entertainer and wrote poems. And in his poems as well, you see the use of Ulster Scots words and phrases balanced with English. And that has been a long process. It's been a long attrition, effectively, against Ulster Scots as a language, and it hasn't been helped by the fact that English and Ulster Scots are quite close as languages. So often it has been seen that Ulster Scots is not a proper language and not proper English, and English is the dominant language. And of course that was the case. That's how it came about. And from about 1650 onwards, Ulster Scots written forms in Ireland were generally discarded in favour of English. So originally, up until 1650, these Scots settlers who had come across into Ulster, they would have written and conversed in Ulster Scots, in their own Ullans or Lallans language. But from 1650 onwards, things change, because English becomes the language of the law, effectively, and the official language. And the consequence of that was that Ulster Scots, although it survived until the latter 18th and early 19th century in written form, that was not something that was standardized across the board. So there are variations, there are geographical variations to Ulster Scots in terms of spelling of words, and sometimes also in terms of the use of words as well too. But it did survive, and it's survived until today. To me, there's a little irony in that it was seen as a very rude, rural, ignorant language, but yet it was often the ordinary people, and particularly the rural people in the countryside, who kept it alive. They were the custodians of it, and they managed to ensure that it survived against all the odds right down through the years. And yet they were seen as being uneducated people, and that they were just ignorant of many things in terms of knowledge and all the rest of it. So there's a great irony and a great paradox, I think. It's a wee lesson there for us all in terms of how we look at things, I think. There were revivals when the language was written down. Mostly it wasn't written down, as I said. Mostly it was an oral language that was transmitted. But it was written during these revivals. The Ulster Weaver poets, people like James Orr that I spoke about, there was a revival at that time in the latter years of the 1700s into the 19th century. Then Ulster Scots was being written by these poets. And other times then towards the latter part of the 19th century, you did begin to see Ulster Scots stories appearing in newspapers. Newspaper editor called W.G. Little was instrumental in that, and certainly in his area, and he wrote a series of sketches, Robin's Readings, and had several characters including Robin and Paddy McQuillan, and they spoke in the broad Ulster Scots dialect of the Ards Peninsula and North Down in his case. So there were those revivals, but often and usually it was an oral language that was being passed down. And there is some interesting comments from people who've studied the language. The late Professor Michael Montgomery carried out extensive study of the language from Scotland to Ulster and then across indeed into America as well too. And he said, in the popular mind, speaking Ulster Scots usually came to represent inferior social class and a lack of education. Without positive associations in the culture at large, Ulster Scots became, not surprisingly, covert, used only with native speakers, as a result of which there are almost no recordings of it. So this sense of it representing a lower social class, a less educated people, that then created a stigma from 1650s onwards. So it's no wonder that a lot of the language was lost and was forgotten about. But in rural communities, and where people moved from rural communities into towns and kept talking in their own homes in Ulster Scots, then it managed to ensure its survival. Not perhaps as the full language it had been prior to 1650, of course, but through phrases and words that were used. So it's really interesting to me, and I was involved with a class at our local primary school a few years ago now in Ulster Scots, and when I went in at the start, it was a 4-week session we had, one day a week, one afternoon a week, and we started off by asking the children if any of them knew any Ulster Scots. Nobody put their hand up. Nobody knew any Ulster Scots in the classroom of P7 pupils. But once we started to explore what Ulster Scots was and what some of the words and the phrases were, by week 4, all the hands were up, and they were actually asking a lot of questions about the words and the phrases, and they were listening to people around them and listening to what they were saying and trying to identify with the use of Ulster Scots words. So to something of an extent today, I'm going to go through the same process. We're going to look at some of the words, some of the descriptions that are Ulster Scots, and you can see if you recognise any of them and if you've heard them or maybe even used them. So let's see how we get on with that. Heed, Fizzog, Brew, Neb. Shooter, Shanks, Een, and Oxter. So how did you get on then? Some of those are easy to understand, probably because they are in general use. So your heed, of course, is your head. Fizzog might be slightly more difficult for some people. I've found in the past have carried out Ulster Scots language talks in different parts of Northern Ireland, and in the west of the country there seemed to be a lack of any knowledge about that word Fizzog, certainly in some places. So Fizzog is just a word for your face. Your Fizzog is your face. An interesting word. Brew is your brow. Your brew is your brow. And neb is, of course, your nose. And sometimes people might be advised not too politely to keep their neb out of somebody else's business. So that could be one way that might occur. The other ones, then shooter. Well, shooter's your shoulder. Your shanks, that's an interesting one. And your shanks are your legs. If you've ever heard anybody saying that they're going somewhere on Shanks's pony, it means that they've no other way of getting there, or they've chosen to walk to get there. So Shanks's pony is just using your legs to get from A to B. The een, well, that's just your eyes, your een. Your E is a singular and een is a plural for eyes. And oxter is a fantastic word. If you're up to your oxters, then you're up to your armpits in something or other. You could be up to your oxters in clabber. Hopefully you wouldn't be. You'd be up to your oxters in mud or muck. But you could be up to your oxters in another way, that you could be really, really busy. I'm up to my oxters with things that I've got today. So that's what those words mean. And some of them you may know, some of them you may not know, but there are different words to describe parts of the body. Now here's a few examples of language characteristics from Ulster Scots. I have a short time, so I can't really go into a full detail about Ulster Scots grammar and usage of language, but this gives you some sense of how the language operates, hopefully. Well, I hope you get a sense of the use of language and words in Ulster Scots and so forth. There's so many examples. There's a whole language of examples, of course, of how Ulster Scots is written and is spoken, but they'll give you something of a flavour, hopefully. And there's many other examples. I like some of the ways that the language operates. One of the prime things, of course, is that it's quite an economical language, so they don't use any more words than they really essentially have to. And there's a great example of that I have locally from Larne in County Antrim, and it surrounds a man going up to a house. He wants to speak to the lady in the house, and her husband is out in the garden. So he's going to ask her if his wife is in so that he can speak to her. So the conversation goes along the lines of the gentleman approaching the house. He asks the one word shin, and the gentleman in the garden, he responds with the one word shiz. So shin and shiz convey the fact that she's there and you can go and have a word with her. So that's how economical Ulster Scots is. And it also operates in another way too, in terms of being economical. If there's a letter isn't required, well, you just don't use it. And often that's why ing ends up with the G dropped. So dropping the G is one of the characteristics of Ulster Scots. So in English it would be driving or running or reading or speaking, but in Ulster Scots it's driving, running, speaking or reading. So we just drop that G and get it out of the way, because it's not really essentially needed, is it, when you think about it? So that's another the wee elements of the language. Another element is a diminutive form. So usually that involves an IE being put at the end of a word. So for example, in English you'd refer to a lamb or a dog, but a lamb could certainly be referred to as a lammie, and sometimes even as a wee lammie as well, which is a double use of the diminutive. A dog would be a wee dog, or a wee doggy. So that IE often appears at the end of the word. It could be a drappie, a small drop. It could be a birdie, a bird. And use of it occurs in Robert Burns's poetry as well, to a mouse, quite famously, where he says, "We sleek it, Karen, timorous beastie, oh what a panic's in thy breastie." And James Orr, the poet I spoke about earlier on, he has a similar poem called To a Sparrow, which he describes the sparrow as a wee wanton little thocht birdie. Wee wanton little thocht birdie. Birdie, Birdie. And so again, you got we and you got ie at the end too. So that's another way that it's a nice way that the language operates. Now, it's essentially a rural language, as you heard earlier, that it came from the rural community. Even when it went into urban areas, it was still essentially contained within that rural community, because that's the people who held on to it. So I'm going to read you now and let you have a sense of what Ulster Scots sounds like. And this is a humorous little poem, which I hope you're going to enjoy. It's about a pig, and in Ulster Scots, a pig is a soo, S-O-O. So this pig was at a place called Raloo, which is outside Larne, and it was out grazing on the road when a bus came along driven by a man called Taboo. That was his nickname, Taboo, and he is centrepiece to this little poem. So I'm going to read this to you. It's called The Sioux from Raloo, and I'm going to read it nice and slow, so you hopefully get a flavour of it and understand some of the Ulster Scots words, get a sense of those as we go through it then too. So, The Sioux from Raloo. Taboo was driving the bus down frae Raloo the day he killed the Commons Sioux. He hot her fair atween the een, with the cleanest clout you've ever seen. And down she went without a squeal. The old collie dog was at her heel. Well, he turned about and he let a yell, and in the gate he went like, well, McCommon heard the bloomin' fuss, and he looked o'er the wall and he saw the bus. He run straight out, though he's queer and fat, and he says to the boy, what made you do that? Well, says Taboo, canny you see, your pig ran out in front of me. 'Twas on the brakes and the clutch I stood, but all of that proved nae good. Well, Taboo, you know, was a decent lad, and the loss of this Sioux made him kinda sad. But McCommon soon quit his loud narration when Taboo in his grief spoke the word compensation. The half o' Raloo had all heard a whed that the old Sioux was worth about 15 quid. But the owner says, you're all making fun. That Sioux with the litter is worth over 30 pun. Well, the police came up frae out Larne town and measured the road baith up and down. And yen police man to the other he says, nae more on this roadside she's going to grace. Well, they sent the old Sioux to the abattoir, and the butchers came from the Lord knows where, each hoping within his soul to buy the old Sioux that was felt staying cool. Well, the butcher man that bought her so, he wondered what was best to do, for the clout she got the Sioux would spoil. Och, what doesn't he do to fry? Well, maybe do to boil. Well, he made her into sausage meat. Her head, her lugs and all her feet. And what didn't he go into sausage meat? He mixed it into veal. And I'll tell you how he ended up. Sure, he only lost the squeal. And I hope you enjoyed that little poem, got a sense of it. That's The Sioux from Raloo, and that was recorded in the early 1990s. That's where I got the transcript from, by a great raconteur and folklorist from this area called Matt Maharg. So I say I hope you've enjoyed that and you got a sense of what Ulster Scots sounds like, and the use of the words and how it all comes together. Now, I'm planning to share another wee reading in Ulster Scots with you before the end of our wee programme today. But I wanted just to reflect maybe on some words, particularly rural words that are significant in Ulster Scots. And I'm also going to have a wee look at some favourite words later on too, some of my favourite Ulster Scots words as well. But in terms of rural words, coming from a rural community, as I'm well aware, lots of descriptive terms for the area around you, for the landscape and so on, but also descriptive terms on the farm. So one of the interesting words is cassie, which could refer to a causeway or a yard, or potentially it can refer to a laneway. I know one reference, locally where it refers to a laneway, but a cassie would have been a word for a causeway or a route. Sometimes at the back of the farmyard out to the fields, the cassie would be at the back of the yard, at the back of the farm. So it's not a very common word in usage now, but there's still a few examples of it around. On the farm, if you're not careful, you can always end up in clabber. And W.F. Marshall in his Me and Me Da famously mentions about being up to his knees in clabber. So clabber is another word for mud or muck. If you're clabbered, you're covered in muck. And you could be walking through a lot of clabber in the winter time if you're out crossing between fields and all the rest of it. So clabber is a good word. And another word which I was familiar with too growing up on the farm was the very expressive word dunkel. And the dunkel was where all the dung from the bar and from the animals when they were in over the winter time, it was brought out and put in the dunkel, or the midden would be another term for it, but it was used as dunkel in our case. And when animals were kept in the bar, there was a group at the back where all the straw mixed up with the animal waste was lifted with a grape and brought out and put in the dunkel, and then it was spread over the fields when the right time came of the year to do that. So dunkel for me is always an everlasting memory because of that word. I think it's fantastic. Also, loaning or loany is another way of expressing loaning, and that just means a laneway. It's a lane or a laneway, and it also comes into play in my case. I remember it in terms of field names. So a lot of farms would have had field names. Individual fields would have been named because farms were not very large. The average size of a farm, certainly in County Antrim up until the end of the Second World War, was 30 acres, and 30 acres isn't really very big in terms of farm sizes today. It'd be difficult to make a living off 30 acres of land nowadays, but that's why all the fields had names. And usually when people talk about the fields, they drop the D, sorry, at the very end there, so it's field as opposed to field. So the field names related to every different field on the farm would have had a name. Our farm was no different. We had the dam field, quarry field, the low fields, the big field, the front field, the calves field, and we had a loaning as well. We had the cows loaning, and that was the laneway that the cows came up for milking time, came up from the low fields up to the bar, up the cows loaning. And of course they weren't called cows in Ulster Scots, they're called kye. And there's a fantastic poem by a man called Charlie Gillen called When All the Kye Had Names. And small farms had not met large herds of cows, so it was a much more personalised relationship between the farmer and his livestock. So all the kye did have names, and I remember that on our farm as well too, that they all had names. So those are some of the rural names that you would have found. There's lots of other names in the landscape and so on, which I'm going to look at in another film. But that gives you a sense of the rural community and the rootedness of the language within the rural area, which is where it comes from. And I'm going to talk about another name from the rural area later on, because it's one of my favourite Ulster Scots names, and I'll tell you the story of it and how I came to identify what it meant, because it was a bit of an unusual one and a bit of an enigma of a word, effectively. So we'll be looking at that just towards the end of our programme here. But I'm going to read to you another extract now from some Ulster Scots literature. And this one is from W.G. Little that I'm coming to now. Wesley Greenhill Little was born in Newtownards in 1844 and was prominent as a journalist and a writer. He's well remembered for his works in Ulster Scots, including Robin's Readings, Betsy Gray, or Sons of the Sod. He died in November 1896 at the relatively young age of only 52 years, and the Belfast Newsletter described him as a man of ability and indomitable perseverance, noting that he had raised himself to a high position among the journalists of Ireland. Of his writings, particularly Robin's readings, which he actually performed on stage, the paper said that he was the delineator of those inimitable readings which have brightened many a fireside and charmed many an audience. So this then is an extract from The Adventures of Paddy McQuillan, His Christmas Day by W.G. Little. Yen Christmas Day, I thocht I would gang to Belfast and spend a wheen hours there. I had never seen the place, and I had been saving up all my happens for a good while so that I would be able to enjoy myself. I put on my new clothes and I started for the train. I saw nobody that I kent till I got to Belfast. Wayne's dear, it's a big toon that, and an awful place for spending money. You could hardly get over the long brig before laying out a sixpence. When I got out of the station house and saw the crowds of folk running this road and the other road, I got that scart for fear of losing myself that I had a notion of laying down ahint the station house till the train would be ready to birl back home again. However, I plucked up heart and I went out to the front door. I seen summat there that pleased me. I'm sure there wasnae less nor 20 horses and jaunting cars. Some of them was birling away with folk on them and others was standing waiting. I was terrible fond of horses, so I stood looking at them and admiring them. Behold ye, I hadnae stood glaring very long till ane of the drivers nodded at me and laughed. I laughed back at him. "A Merry Christmas to ye," says he. "The same to you, sir," says I, wondering in me and mine who he kent me. "Does your mother know you're out?" says he. "Oh, 'deed she does," says I. "I hope she's in good health," says he. "Pretty middling, sir," says I, "except that she's now and then bothered with the rheumatics." "Will you take a drive?" says he, rubbing the dust off the cushions for fear they would dirty my new clothes. "Oh, thank you, sir," says I. "It would be o'er muckle trouble, and we'll used to travelling." "Jump on," says he. "It's no every day you get a drive, and Christmas only comes once a year." So I got on the car. "Where tae?" says he. "Oh, just whatever road you're going yourself," says I. "I'm nae way particular. Dinna let me take you off your ain road." "Well," says he, "the shops are all closed up, and the town looks like a Sunday, but if you like I'll take you up to see the college and the theatre, and some other big biggins." "Whatever you like, sir," says I. "I was never here afore." I thought I saw the chap laughing 2 or 3 times till he had to wipe the water out of his een, but then he would say something funny either to me or to the horse that made us all laugh. Says I as we went along, "Sir, what's the meaning of them rails laid through the streets? They look just like railroads." "Oh, 'deed," says he, shaking his head, "there'll soon be nae work for the like of me, for the trains frae Newton and Bangor and Donaghadee and other places will soon be running into the town and dropping the folk wherever they want to stop." Poor fella, I thocht a pity o' him. I'm sure he was roaring, for he put his hanky up to his face, and when he took it down again, it was like to burst, it was that red. "And I suppose you hae a wife and family?" says I. "Oh, 'deed I hae," says he, "and it's no easy to provide for them." "Aye, man dear, it's ower ocht hoe muckle weans can eat," says I. "You would say that," says he, "if you had seen them at their breakfast this morning afore I come out." "How mony hae ye?" says I. "The baker's dozen," says he, "and when their ma and me sits down with them that makes 15 at the table. Well, it's a sicht to see 15 knives playing dab at the int print of butter. Och, a nee, it's no lang till it's out of sight, I can tell ye." The dear man, that beats ocht, says I. Well, that's nearly the end of our wee time together today. Hope you've enjoyed that reading from His Christmas Day. And Paddy, of course, goes to Belfast. He's not been there before, and it ends up that this is a taxi man, of course, with his jaunting car, and he ends up charging Paddy for the trip round Belfast, which Paddy takes a bit of an offence at because he thought it was just he was going anyway and he was going to take him with him. But it's all quite comical, and there's lots more in the vein of which we read, so it gives you some sense of Ulster Scots in the written form. But Ulster Scots in its spoken form is fascinating too, and because it was an oral language and not often written down in many areas, then that's why there's variations from area to area that you can find, and you find lots of examples of that all over the place. But I wanted to just leave you with some of my personal best Ulster Scots words. Some words that I think are just fantastic in Ulster Scots, and some of them are actually about numbers. So the word wheen, I think, is a fantastic word. Wheen is an unquantifiable number. So a wheen of people could be 20 people in a room, or it could be 2,000 people outside at an event. Wheen just covers it all, and it can even cover a smaller number. So wheen could be down to 4 or 5 people, maybe it could be a wheen of folk. I just think it's fantastic. One of the ones that is more definable is 1, 4, 2 or 3 in standard English, and that in Ulster Scots is twarthy. So twarthy folk were gathered up there. So 2 or 3, twa or 3 becomes twarthy. It's how people speak quite fast with it and put it together. So I think it's a great wee word too. There's another word called shiroi, which is a word for it's a group of people again, but this time they're also noisy as well as being all together. So a wheen of people could be together, a considerable number of them, but there might not be much noise from them. It might be quite quiet. But a hail shiroi of folk would be a group of people together, and they're all talking and they're all noisy, and there's a lot of noise coming from that particular group. So that would be a shiroi, which is another nice word. I like a word called bachel, and a bachel is somebody that's a bit clumsy. They're a bit of a bachel. They have a bit of trouble maybe climbing up a dike or something like that there. They'll slide down and they'll fall down, and somebody would say, look at that bachel. And in our area it was changed slightly from bachel to pachel, so the B was swapped for a P in terms of the word, so it became pachel instead. So somebody was a pachel, they were making a bit of heavy work about getting something done. They were pacheling about and all the rest of it. So I think that's a great, really, really greatly expressive word in Ulster Scots. I like that there's crossover in Ulster Scots with other languages, and that happens with all language, of course. There's lots of crossover in terms of the English language, in terms of Ulster Scots, in terms of Irish language. We find crossovers in terms of how people are using words and expressions and so on. And there's a couple of nice ones in our area. One is called Cairn Brock, and a brock in Ulster Scots and in Irish, pardon me, is a badger, of course. So cairn is a Scottish word for a memorial cairn, or a cairn of stones. So Cairn Brock means the cairn of the badgers, literally. But it can be, say, it's crossover between both those languages is quite clear there. And also, I like the word or the words Todd's Rodden, which is a place name not so far away from me here. And Rodden is a Ulster Scots or an Irish word for an unpaved pathway or roadway. So a rodden could be a cow path up through the fields, and any of you from the country will know that animals make their own paths. Cows make them, foxes and badgers can make them as well too in the countryside. So a rodden is an unpaved roadway or path, and a tod is a good Scottish word used by Robert Burns and other poets, James Hogg, the Ettrick Shepherd and others, and Sir Walter Scott, the author, to describe a fox. So that's a word for fox, is the word tod. So Todd's Rodden near me here is a combination of those Irish and Ulster Scots influences in terms of that place name, and it's an area where a fox was renowned for making his path or his pad along through the fields near the farms. So that to me that's really interesting. And the other one that I think is it's absolute treasure to me because it relates to our own farm, and it's a word that I had no idea what it meant. It was a bit of an enigma of a word. And whenever I was growing up, there was an area called the Squaws, or the Squaw Field. And the Squaw Field wasn't a big field, it was just an area in the corner of a larger field. It had some lint dams in it, which would have been used for the process of making flax, growing flax and making lint. And I was always told not to go near the squaws because it was dangerous, because of those lint dams that were all full of water, and there was 3 of them. And I tried for quite some time to find out what that word meant, and I spoke to people in the neighbourhood about it. The older generation were gone that had used that word, so I couldn't find out directly from them anymore. And the local people didn't know, nobody knew what the word meant. I spoke to Ulster Scots folk about it, and they had no idea of this word squaw. And I spoke to Irish language folk as well too, and they didn't understand what it might mean either. So it was only when I was reading the Ulster Scots grammar that prepared by Dr. Philip Robinson that I had this revelation, because I was reading about how one of the rules in Ulster Scots says that they can, as well as dropping words like drop on the G, remember we talked about that, they can add letters as well. So if somebody's called Hugh, for example, they can become Shoe or Shoey in Ulster Scots. So they add an S to the front of the word, as opposed to dropping a G from the end of a word. So it was at that point that I started to think about this word squaws. And I thought, well, I wonder has the S been added to it? So then I went to a County Antrim Ulster Scots dictionary, a man called Jim Fenton, and I looked it up. And sure enough, in the dictionary, quaw was a word, an Ulster Scots word, for a swamp or a marshy area. And it fits perfectly the area of the squaws on that farm, because the reason the lint dams were there, first of all, was because it was always a wet place. The water was coming down through there, so it filled up into the lint dams then. So it was a marshy place, it was a wet place. And my father, and probably his father, had pronounced that word quaw as squaw, unwittingly given a perfect example of this rule of adding the word S at the front of some of the word, the letter S at the front of some of the words. So for me, that's just pure treasure. That's fantastic to identify that. As when we did the project in the local primary school, we called it the Search for the Lost Language, and we had a sort of a idea. It was a bit of an adventure trying to find lost words and lost phrases and so on that people might have used. So for me, that was part of a lost language, part of it coming back again. And you know, we have such a rich variety of culture in our society. And for me, Ulster Scots culture and language is a very important part of that. So I hope you've found this of interest. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation, and I thank you for listening to me. So, for you, I hope to see you again.